Well, good evening, Harbor Church, and others that are listening. Welcome you here tonight, Wednesday night. And I want to talk a little bit about historical shifts or historical cycles. I talked a little bit about it on Sunday morning, but I would like to take a couple weeks and give you some examples of exactly what I'm talking about. And while doing so, I also want to point out in the middle of these historical shifts, God's at work in every one of them building his kingdom. It's not God at work here, God at work there, but whenever we see a shift, whenever we see things changing, we get freaked out, we get worried, but God's in charge. God's got everything under control. Excuse me. And so tonight I want to start and I want to look at Egypt. And I want excuse me. I want to talk about the Pre-Dynastic Period, talk about 6,000 BC. You know, when we look at Egypt, we look at Rome, the Greek states, Babylon, we see empires or political entities that have spread out over a long period of time. But as we get closer to more modern history, we see the dynamics of the rise and decline of a state that it happens much more rapidly. So let's start with Egypt, and we're starting at about 6,000 BC. Thank you. Some of the things that were happening at the time. Papyrus was harvested for the first time. And I found that in Egypt, they had many different uses for papyrus, so we'll talk about some of those in a little later. Burial of the dead became tradition and ceremonial, and the concepts of the afterlife were starting to develop. A legal system is developing, art is growing. Apis, the sacred bull, starts to become a major object of worship in Egypt. Anubis is developed as a god. The worship of Osiris starts. The followers of Horus, the ruling cult, develop. 5000 BC, agriculture begins to develop and farms are organized. Trade between Egypt and Babylon begins. Babylon was a city-state around the Syrian-Turkey border. Art depictions are developed around 4000 BC, paying homage to political leaders, military leaders, and of course the gods. In 3200 BC, Thebes becomes the center of the worship of Ammon. Hieroglyphic writings are developed, and the use of legal precedent is developed, something that we still use today, legal precedent. The first dynasty began around 3150 to 2613 BC. Remember, when we're talking about BC, we're talking downwards, not upwards. So we're going backwards until we reach the year 0. The first obelisks were developed, and upon them were given praises to deities and to the city and to the local political leaders. Narmer united the upper and the lower Egyptian peoples. Memphis became the center of worship. In 1300 BC, trade between Egypt and Syria began. 2990 BC, Merit, the first female ruler of Egypt, ruled. Seshut is declared the goddess of writing. So what we see happening in these infant times is we see them beginning to develop their own unique culture. They're developing their own gods. We don't have much, or I didn't find much information that would tell me what the gods that they in the area worshipped before the time of the pharaohs, but we see the gods beginning to develop. We see also the political tensions. A lot of times we look at a empire or a large military political state, and we don't realize that there's more to it than this giant entity. If we looked at the United States of America today, we would look and we would say, you know what, we have serious competition for power in our country. We have serious competition from China. We have serious competition from Russia, from Europe, from North Korea, from some of the other Asian countries, from the Middle East. We've got all kinds of people that in one way or another we compete with. And so we're in the kind of competition that can have geopolitical and geomilitary consequences. And it's no different for the people of Egypt at this time. Remember, they're a group of people that are starting to come together. Their leaders are starting to move away from tribalism and trying to unite people into a city-state. But there's a lot of things that haven't quite been developed yet that need to be developed for a state to become more than just a tribal community. The second dynasty started in 2890 and it lasted to about 2670 BC. The concepts from the Egyptian Book of the Dead are developed at this period of time, which has great consequences for the development and the ruling of Egypt in the centuries to come. The first step pyramids were developed. The first royal burial sites were developed. So now you see a ruling class beginning to develop out of these people, and with that, there's also going to be a learned class. There's going to be a military class. In the third dynasty, between 2670 and 2613, and as if you notice when you listen to some of these dynasties, we're not talking about a dynasty that lasts for 1,000 years or even 500 years. In most cases, we're seeing the same kind of things happening in Egypt at this time that we later see in the struggle with the kings of Israel and in other situations similar to this. So in this third dynasty period, King Giza starts the first pyramid. The things that we look at today and we marvel over, these are just beginning to happen. Also in Egypt at this time, medicine is developing and the first medical textbooks are written. In the fourth dynasty, roughly 2613 to 2589 BC, trade with the city-state Punt begins. Anubis is declared the sole god of the dead throughout the land of Egypt. Memphis is declared the capital. The Pyramid of Giza complex is started, and legal practices begin. Yes, we can track it down and see this is where the lawyers' offices developed here in ancient Egypt. In 2500 BC, the Sphinx was started. Things that we look at and we marvel today, we see their beginning here. Then there's the first intermediate period, and it goes roughly 2181 to 2040. Again, we're not talking about a long period of time. The capital is moved away from Memphis to Herculopolis. Thebes is a city on the rise. In 2115 BC, Thebes goes to war against Herodotus, and in 2040 to 1782 BC, Monthotep develops the Middle Kingdom. He conquers all the Egyptian rivals. He makes Thebes the political center of this new Egyptian empire, and Memphis becomes the religious center. Again, in 1991 to 1962 BC, Egypt develops its first standing army. Most city-states at that time, their armies were conscripted at a moment's notice to meet a need. And Egypt is now developing an army that will stand at their borders and that will carry out their will amongst their neighbors. This is a tremendous step. The first intermediate period in 2181 to 2040. Let me catch back up here. He conquers all his Egypt rivals. Thebes becomes the political center, Memphis the religious center, and the first standing army develops. Then in 1787 to 1760, we're talking about 18 years. Cinyras becomes the most powerful ruler in this period of Egypt's history. In 1807 to 1802, the first ruler of the female ruler of the Middle Kingdom rises. And in 18 BC, the Middle Kingdom begins to decline. And from this part on, and we're going to find this over the next couple of weeks, in the different political entities that we look at, we're going to see a rise, and then we're going to come to a period of decline. Now, sometimes we'll see a rise from the ashes, if you will, but most of these times we see a continuous decline. And remember, my position is this, is that God's at work in every one of these governments, every one of these periods. We can see his hand at work. Well, let me get back here. In the 1800s, the Middle Kingdom begins to decline. But something else is happening around the Middle East and in Southern Europe that is changing everything, and that's the beginning of the Bronze Age. Egyptian medicine develops, and this is one of those uses for papyrus that I would have never imagined. But the Egyptian medical community develops a gynecological papyrus for women. So go figure. In a few minutes, I want to get to the connection between our Old and New Testament with Egypt. But I would like to continue moving on here. The second intermediate period, 1782 to 1570 BC. The king of Cush develops south of Egypt around 1700 BC. Now, this is another country, and it's a strong, vibrant, developing country that's developing on the southern edge of this Egyptian empire. And so naturally, its development is going to be seen as a threat to the authorities in Egypt. But what we're going to find at this period of time is the authorities of Egypt change rapidly. And sometimes the authorities of Egypt aren't even Egyptian. So the king of Cush develops south of Egypt around 1700 BC. Egypt's divided. The high coast capital, Avars, the Egyptians' capital is in Thebes, and the Nubians are in the south. And in the midst of this, so you've got this country that had been unified, and now it's broke off into three people groups, not three regional groups, but three distinct peoples who have a history together, and the history is not always good. So we see immediately, even though I imagine there's some kind of worked out truce here, we know immediately that Thebes attacks the Hyksos people. And in 1575 BC, Thebes seeks their capital. And so their goal is to expel them from Egypt, which they do 5 years later in 1570. And this leads us to the period of the new Middle Kingdom between 1570 and 1069 BC. I want to again point out to you that we're talking about a mere 500 years of thousands of years. The Egyptians and Thebes almost unify all of Egypt once again. And the Book of the Dead is written and codified. In 1504 to 1492, Egypt reaches its largest geological boundaries. At that time, the Egyptian power reaches all the way to the Euphrates River. And in 1457 BC, at the Battle of Medico, Egypt defeats a coalition of local Canaanite and area powers and becomes the supreme power at that time. But again, I want to point out something that may not stand obvious here. They've just increased their borders into the Holy Land, and now they're putting themselves at conflict with other people. There's the Assyrians, there's the Hittites, there's the Persians, there's other kingdoms that now they're going to come up against, and so they're going to face challenges from other areas. The Amarna period between 1348 and 1320 BC, religious reforms banned the traditional religious thought and practice of the time. The capital moves from Thebes to Amarna, and in 1336, King Tut actually takes power of Egypt. He restores the traditional religions, and then we find things are going to once again take a bad turn for the continuity of the people of Egypt. Hornhead erases the memory of Amarna in 1320 to 1292. He spends over 20 years just attacking and destroying. And remember, these battles didn't happen like desert storms. They're sieges, they're raids, and they go on and on again together. The capital, I think I lost my place. Yeah, Hornadab becomes king, and in 1303, Ramesses II is born. Now, Hornadab, his whole desire was to erase the memory of the government of Amarna. And so he did that. After him, we find Ramses II is born. Ramses I was the founder of the 14th dynasty. He revitalized the economy and the empire. Then he was succeeded by Ramses II in 1279 to about 1212. Ramses II ruled. In 1274 BC, the Battle of Kadesh, Ramses II versus the Hittites. And because of this battle, the first known treaty between political states or countries was signed at this time after the Battle of Kadesh between the Egyptians and the Hittites. And then we also see at this point in 1213 to 1203 BC, the Israelites are introduced into the story. In 1186 to 1155, Ramesses III is the last strong Egyptian leader. In 1180, Egyptian is invaded by what was called the Sea People, and they responded by building fortifications to fend them off. The Sea People were believed to come from different areas: the Greece states, Phoenicia, Cyprus, Turkey, some of the areas, and there are just some of them. In 1178, the Egyptians defeat the Sea People once and for all. Between the years 1170 and 1077, Ramesses rules and Per Ramesses, and the priests rule at Thebes. Next, it brings us to the third intertestament period, or intermediate period, excuse me. 1069 to 525 BC. Ironworking is developed in Egypt in 750 BC. In 750 BC, the king Pile of the Cush country in the south of Egypt conquers Egypt in 721. In 761, Egypt is conquered by Assyria and Memphis is destroyed. 767 to 765, Memphis is rebuilt and rebellion broke out. In 666 BC, Syria once again sacks Thebes. In 665 to 610, Paskiki frees Egypt from Assyrian rule, and Memphis is rebuilt again. In 653, Egypt completely expels Assyrians. But in 651, Nebuchadnezzar attempts to invade Egypt. In 562, 525, Babylon invades and conquers, moves the capital to Memphis, and it's what's called a satrap. It's a place ruled basically by a foreign government. We see that what happens after Ramesses, say he was the last strong ruler in Egypt. We see after that, because of the weak rulers and because of the bickering and all the stuff amongst the people, we see that that they're susceptible. They're susceptible to invasion from the south, from the east, from the northeast. 525 to 400 BC, Persians rule in Egypt, an invasion of Nubia. The Persians move in. They rule Egypt. They invade Nubia to the south. In 522, the rule of Darius the Great begins. Babylon uses Egypt as a base to attack the Greek states. Remember, at that time, Persia was at war with the Greeks, and they were invading across the Bosporus Straits. There were Turkey and Egypt come together. We get the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae there, and they were looking for another front. They were looking if they had help from these Egyptians, that the Persians would be so engrossed in their war with Greece that they would be able to free the country of Egypt. Babylon uses Egypt as a base to attack the Greek states, and in 460-454, the Egyptian revolt against the Persians with the help of the Greeks moves on. Plato travels to Egypt and to share in the knowledge. Now, before I get back to the Bible part of this, I want to show you the end of the Egyptian Empire. And this is called the Ptolemy period. Now, Ptolemy was a general of Alexander the Great. And upon his death, Alexander's empire had been divided up between, I think, 5 generals. One of them was Ptolemy in Egypt. The other one was Seleucid up in the Syria area. But Ptolemy, in his time, we've seen the last native ruler. Egypt is again defeated by the Persians. Alexander defeats Syria, and he turns towards Egypt. Upon conquering Egypt, Alexander plants the city he named after himself, Alexandria. Egypt is conquered without resistance. Alexander dies in 323. Ptolemy is appointed the ruler of Egypt by Alexander, and he had Alexander entombed in Memphis. Ptolemy's rulership brings the rise of Hellenism, Greek thought, Greek life to Egypt. The Library of Alexander is developed at this time. The Lighthouse of Alexander. And then there's the constant battles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And one last person that comes out of the story of them we know as Cleopatra, who allowed herself to get caught up in the battles of kings, and she paid with her life. But now I want to go to just a second here, and then just what we looked at tonight, I want to show you biblical connections. We know in Genesis chapter 12, we know that Abram and Sarai go to Egypt because of a famine in their land. And we know that Abram was scared, so he told his wife to tell people he was his sister, and he set up this possible conflict with the Pharaoh at that time. We also know that in the time of Jacob, there was a connection. They went back to Egypt. Where's this connection come from? From the time of Moses? Through the time of the building of the kingdom? And I submit to you that it carries on in the New Testament today. Moses led Egypt because he was the son of royalty. He wasn't just accidentally scooped up by a woman and then picked, 40 years later to do this. This was a divine appointment in Egypt that God had for Moses that would begin the liberation of his people. It was a divine appointment that God had with Joseph and with Jacob when the family came back and they were facing starvation. It wasn't a coincidence that in a time of danger that the parents of Jesus wrapped him in a blanket, put him in the rear seat of a donkey, and took him to Egypt, where he waited until he was sent back. There's cycles through history, people. We're not the first country to ever be in a place like we are now. And so us freaking out or us presuming the worst or thinking the worst, that doesn't cut it. Because no matter what the cycle in history was, God was at work. And that's what we're going to look at. God's been at work in these situations, and he's at work today in yours and I. And I believe with all my heart that one day, one of these cycles is going to include a blowing of a trumpet and the appearance of a king. Lord, I thank you for each and every person here tonight. Bless them. Pour your Spirit out in Jesus' name. Amen.